Good morning. Today we are going to discuss the interview question, which is the difference between Spring and Spring Boot. Basically, the Spring is developed on the top of Java JTE framework, but whereas Spring Boot, which is extension of Spring, so Spring Boot is Spring plus plus. But in Spring, we need to configure jars manually and bins manually. So a lot of boilerplate code, manual work is required to develop and build a Spring-based applications. Whereas Spring Boot, a lot of starters, dependency managements. Basically, you configure less, but you get more productivity by using Spring Boot. So Spring Boot is advanced version of Spring. Now look at the configuration. So in the Spring, we need to configure beans through XML or annotations, as well as there are a lot of boilerplate code, means redundant code we will be writing in the Spring. Whereas Spring Boot, by using starters or bean configurations, by using annotations, which is much more robust, easy, and through dependencies you can get the jars, related jars, dependent jars, relative jars easily. So Spring Boot takes care of pulling all the required jars and able to get the containers and able to get the beans automatically. So that is the beauty of Spring Boot. Whereas Spring, you need to configure jars, you need to create the container, a lot of manual work. Now look at the dependency management. In Spring, you need to manually add jars and you need to specify the versions. So when you add more jars, make sure that each jar compatible with other version. So you need to manage that manually. Whereas Spring Boot, if you just add the starter, it's going to add target jars, dependent jars, relative jars, and we do not mention the version in the Spring Boot at the starter level. It's going to automatically download the related jars, all the required jars, and it will download the latest and compatible jars automatically. And also it will download the dependent components also in Spring Boot. Spring Boot is much more smarter than Spring. Let's look at starters. So Spring doesn't have support for starters. So starters functionality feature is available at Spring Boot level only. Suppose you want to add web related jars to Spring Boot application, what you do? Manually we download those jars and set those jars to the project. Or dependency, we can configure dependency as Maven file so that it will download the jars backend. So in the Spring Boot, when you add a starter, so starter is going to pull all the jars, required jars automatically, and it will compile the project and make it available. Project, it will build the project and make it available for you automatically. But in Spring, we have to manually add jars, configure those jars, you have to set those class paths. But in Spring Boot, it automatically download everything based on dependencies that we configure at pom.xml. If you look at starters, starters basically have this naming template like Spring Boot starter, then starter name. Suppose you want to work with the web-based development, what you gonna do? You're gonna use Spring Boot starter web. This particular dependency is going to pull all the jars from internet and make the application is ready to develop. Suppose you want to deal with the databases from your Spring based application, if you can use this JPA starter, it's gonna pull all the databases, data source objects and make it available for this database application programming. Suppose you want to deal with the MongoDB database, if you can use this starter, it's going to pull all the required jars and make it available for the programming. Let's look at the container. So in Spring, we need to manually create the container. So what we're going to use, we're going to load this XML, which is having configurations for the beans. So we need to load the bean or beans and create an application context. It's nothing but creating a container by using new. We need to pass the XML, which is having configuration of beans. So on the top of that, you can get the bean. But in Spring Boot, we are not going to create the container. Simply, we are going to get the container by Spring application.run. So this particular function or method is going to return the container. So in Spring, we are going to create the container, but here container will be accessible or container will be created automatically when you run the application. And there's something called embedded servers. Means in the Spring level, actually you need to add these servers, configure those servers manually. But in Spring Boot, by default, few servers like JT, Tomcat, Undertow by default available. So if you add a starter, it's going to be the server is going to be automatically available. You need to configure servers. So this will save your time. But in Spring, you need to add the server and you need to configure the server. And one more thing, Spring doesn't support YML configuration files. So in your application, you have the configuration details in a YML file format. It doesn't work out. It doesn't support Spring. But Spring Boot have support of configuration file in the form of YAML or properties file. Both is available at Spring Boot. But here only properties file level configuration that you can do. YAML support is not there. And there is something called in-memory database. Spring doesn't have in-memory database. Means sometimes you want to have your own local database to try something, database related operations, and you want to wipe out the data when the application is shut down. That's called in-memory databases. So when the application is running, it will create a database. When the application is not running, it will not hold the database, it will wipe out the data. So that kind of functionality we have in Spring Boot, not in Spring. So what we need to do, we need to have this dependency H2 database, and you have to configure the database details, and you can access the database by using the host name, port number, and H2 console. So it will bring up the database console. So in-memory database is available at Spring Boot, not in Spring. Microservices. So Spring doesn't have support for microservices. We cannot develop microservices by using Spring. But Spring Boot, yes, we can develop microservices by using Spring Boot framework, and you can register those services at Eruka server and you can access. So communication between the servers services can happen through Eruka server. So that functionality is available at Spring Boot. That functionality is not available at Spring. If you want to develop microservices based application, you have to go for Spring Boot, not Spring. Production features. So in Spring, we do not have something called actuators, but in Spring Boot, we have something called actuators. By using actuators, actually, we know the we can get the configuration details by using actuators and core dumps, memory utilization, and a lot of other details like health check, monitoring the system. So all these available through actuators. So these actuators are available at Spring Boot. It's not available at Spring level. So this is one of the best feature from Spring Boot. So basically, when the application is running, you can see what is happening, how many beans created, class pass, which version of Java you're using, and core dumps, lot of other backend details. Basically, you can see the meta data of an application at Spring Boot, not at Spring. This is powerful tool from Spring Boot. Yeah, so development speed. In Spring, we need to configure manually all the jars, dependents, and everything. So it's kind of, it takes time. Configuration takes time. But in Spring Boot, when you create the application, add the starters or dependencies, then configure the application properties, then straight away you can develop the application. So application development time is faster at Spring Boot. It is slow at Spring, and also Spring you need to configure a lot of other things. So Spring Boot is much better. Yeah, at kind of testing also here. In Spring we can use JUnit or TestNG Marketo, but in Spring Boot we have a lot of other tools like web MSC test and other functionalities, other features are available to test. You can manually test or you can integrate them with TestNG. So Spring Boot has more features for testing. So Spring Boot, if you use Spring Boot for testing, you have more options to validate your code. So Spring Boot is much more easy because one time you configure add the dependencies, you can concentrate on your business logic. But Spring you need to configure a lot of other things. You need to know what you're configuring, how you're configuring, and you need to manage the jar versions. But Spring Boot is much more easy and learning bit faster. Spring Boot backend do a lot of stuff. Sometimes you not to remember anything, just start developing application by using Spring Boot. Yeah, use cases. By using Spring Boot, actually you can technically you can develop microservices based applications. At Spring, you can develop enterprise applications, but Spring Boot has more options. Like you can develop RESTful applications, microservices applications, cloud based applications, a lot of other things. So compared to Spring, Spring Boot has more features.